Hey everybody, welcome back. Now, not too long ago, I had made some statements about the Revolutionary War, and that essentially we neither started the war nor even technically won that war. And some people kind of understood where I was coming from with that, and there's a few people, enough people, if you will, that don't understand what I'm talking about and were like, hey, can you elaborate? Sure, I can, and that's what we're going to do here today. I'm going to try not to make this too much of a historical diatribe. I'm going to keep it simple, and I'm going to make some logical points. And you can come to your own conclusions. You can research this stuff for yourself. Always do your own research if you can. It's very important. And this is especially important if you're a prepper in a prepper group, a survivalist, in a militia, any other type of patriotic group. Because this is one of the biggest lies that you hear. The biggest lies that you hear, it ties in with the whole fantasy, if you will, in the United States of independence and liberty, which technically we never really had in the first place. We were offered a certain amount of privileges, and they've slowly taken it away from us over the centuries, and even more so in the last few decades, and it's getting bad, but we were always under somebody's thumb. And this is big with three percenters. The whole 3% of America was able to fight back the government and beat them back. They weren't Americans, they were colonials, mind you, and it's very important to keep that in mind. That there was no America. Remember this as we go on. That's the first thing, especially if you're a three percenter. You've really got to hone in on that point. There was no America. There were no Americans. The other thing to understand is the war did not end in 1776. Most people, when you talk to them, they think that's what the 4th of July is for. America's independence and we beat the British. 1776 was the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The war did not end until 1873. Okay, the war went on for 8 years. April 19th, 1775 to September 3rd, 1783. I think somebody can look that up. That's very important to remember. It was 8 years. The war was not started by the colonies. The war was started by colonial lawmakers and aristocrats who had personal grudges with the British government and certain of the monarchy within it. Okay? The colony itself, and the fact that it was 3%, think about this, if only 3% of the colonies were behind separating from Great Britain, that should tell you these people did not want to fight the British government. Think about that. So what happened? People within the colonial government and aristocrats in the colonial government are the ones that had the problem and drugged the colonies into it. And George Washington is a great example of this. And there was a book called An Imperfect God, An Imperfect God, and it had a great bibliography. It's a biography of George Washington. George Washington, a terrible general, terrible, so terrible in fact he could not get a British commission. And that's what he really wanted. He didn't want to be a colonial general. He wanted to be a British general. And he wasn't liked by the highbrow British generals because of his job in the colonies. And his job in the colonies was routing indigenous people from their land by any means necessary. And some of the things that he did personally were considered detestable by British generals, not because they were done, but because he did it himself. These are things, the types of things that he did. One thing that sticks out in my mind from the book was having a prisoner held down while his head was cracked open, and Washington would run his hands through their brains to scare the Indians. And again, like I said, not that so much of the British generals and officials and aristocracy were so opposed to that sort of thing, but you don't get your own hands dirty, Washington. What is wrong with you? That was the problem. It's an excellent bibliography if you're interested in the history of George Washington. Again, that's An Imperfect God. So the colonies, the colonialists did not want a war. Lawmakers and aristocrats did. Does that sound familiar? Because I guarantee you pretty much every war that any country has been involved with, the majority of people were not really behind, were they? It was lawmakers that made those decisions, lawmakers that created the situations that brought their people into war, no matter what country it was. The colony, remember, I pointed out, they were not Americans. Colonists were British citizens. And they were used to how the British did business. That's why only 3% were behind the war. they didn't care. The things that they said tipped off anger in the colonies are the things that the people who were in charge of the law, who were in charge of the newspapers, who had all of the authority and the access to the only media at the time, told people was a problem. Some of them believed it, some of them didn't. But they were not interested in fighting a government that they were familiar with. It's like, yeah, this is how the British do things. This is what the British government does. Taxation without representation, big deal. Great Britain's been doing it for centuries, and they still do it, and so does the American government. Do you have control over how your tax money is spent? That's taxation without representation. Think about that. An elected official makes a decision they want to make, not a decision that's necessarily in your best interest. You have no control over how they spend your tax money. That's the complaint. That was the complaint that we're told tipped off this war. But it's not something that, obviously, since only 3% of the colonies were frustrated with this, 97% of the colony didn't care. They were used to that sort of thing. Now, as far as not winning the war, and this is also an important point, especially if you're a 3%er, because part of their argument is part of the argument that I've heard. I don't know all their philosophy, I'm not going to claim to, and many other prepper groups and militia groups, is that, if only 3% of us could get together, we could fight the government off. We could fight them off. Be careful. Be careful with those thoughts. And I'm not trying to discourage you, okay? But you've got to really know the history and what you're talking about. Problem number one, all right, why we did not win, is the Anglo-French War that went from 1778 to 1783. Great Britain was already at war, right on their own doorstep with France, which was a superpower at the time, all right? They couldn't afford to keep diverting resources for some dirty colony in the middle of nowhere, and that is pretty much how they viewed the colonies. It's a little mud patch across the ocean. Is it really even worth going over there and fighting these people, or should we just ignore them? We're at war with France. They're right here. And that war was a big war. It was a major factor. They were fighting on their border all the way out to the Caribbean, all the way out to the West Indies. They were fighting halfway around the world with the French, and the Spanish were coming into the war and not in Britain's favor. British government wasn't aware, another point, of the vast resources the colonies had access to at the time. They didn't know how big the United States was and what resources were available and how huge it could get. And obviously it has gotten very huge, the United States being one of the biggest superpowers in world history. They're not looking too great right now, but still, think about that. But the British, of course, figured, okay, if we walk away from this right now and just deal with France, we can get back to them. We can go back and get to them some other time if we change our mind or if it turns out there's anything of value there, which they did try 30 years later in the War of 1812. But by that time, America, it had gotten too big to fight. It grew too big too fast. There was too much territory, too many resources. Great Britain had no idea in the 1770s what was really available. 1812 rolled around and it was a lost cause. Same problem Britain had with China, where they fought with China and the best they could ever do was get a foothold in Hong Kong. The country was too big, had too many resources. Great Britain was a bully, but they weren't stupid. Next was the King of France, Louis XVI, who entered into a treaty with the newly formed America, if you will, in 1777. And a lot of people believe that it was because, and this is what's taught if they teach it at all, that King Louis saw that the colonists really wanted their independence and decided to send aid to the colony. And that is a lie. That is a complete lie. King Louis saw this as an opportunity to intimidate the British, who feared France was going to send troops to the colony and support to the colonies, which mostly was done through trade. They rarely got involved in our skirmishes, but it was mostly done through trade. They sent gunpowder and uniforms and shoes, things like that. And it was we were supposed to pay it back. It was a loan, if you will. We never paid them, by the way. Keep in mind, it wasn't too much longer before the French Revolution. There was nobody to pay back. So it got over on France on that one. But he just saw it as a way to, okay, yeah, you know, if we make a treaty with the so-called Americas, then the British will be like, oh, Christ, now we're going to fight these guys too. We're going to fight them over there. Next problem is the logistics of fighting the colonies. There was no communication. They couldn't pick up a cell phone and see how things were going in the colonies. Let me just call Philadelphia really quick and see what's up. There was none of that. It was ship-to-shore travel, which was good weather, conservatively speaking, about a 4-month round trip. So if you're in London and you receive a note, you get an important letter to the British government from the colonies. Hey, we lost this battle, we won this battle, which quite frankly, for the most part, the British were whipping the crap out of the colonies. All right, we lost a lot of major battles. But yeah, we need more troops for this, we need supplies for that. And they look at it and they're like, oh God, you know, we're still at war with France. Okay, can we divert materials? Do we have funding for this? How many troops can we spare? Do we have some extra ships that we can send back to the colonies again? By the time they get all that figured out, maybe a month, you know, just again, conservatively speaking, to pay for it, make arrangements and get the troops, send them over there, and then wait 4 more months for a message to come back to let you know how it went. The logistics were absolutely ridiculous. It just was not worth it at the time for the British government to bother with the colonies. They didn't care. They didn't care to win. They could have. They could have beaten it back. They could have defeated the people that were in charge of the revolution and just reasserted themselves with the colonies, and most of the colony, by people's own admission, about almost 97%, would have been fine with it. They wouldn't have cared. So there you go. I mean, like I said, I'm going to keep it real simple. Just some logical points. Think about it for yourself. Again, if you are in a militia prepper group, 3%er, I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm really not. But be realistic about it. The American government isn't going to walk away. They're not going to sit there and say, oh, we're beaten. Or, oh, screw them. It's not worth it. That won't happen. So be very careful. Be very careful and stick together. Too many groups do not stick together. And that's a subject for a whole other discussion about if you are in a prepper or a militia group. They don't get along. A lot of them just don't. And ultimately, that could be your downfall. Just saying. Subject for another point of discussion, really. Do you get where I'm coming from? Do you understand that? And just like I did with George Washington, if you track the history, read the biographies of pretty much every signature on the Declaration of Independence, you'll find something there. These are wealthy people. These were statesmen, politicians, important people, important and influential people of their time that all had personal grudges, who drug a section of the British Empire, the colonies, into a conflict with their own government that the government just was not interested in dealing with. The British government did not care. They had too much going on at the time, and the colonies were too far away for them to bother. So technically we did not win, and technically we did not start it. Or the colonies. We obviously didn't do anything because this was a long time ago. Hey, thoughts? If you have any thoughts about that, please feel free to post them in the comment section down below. Please do give the video a thumbs up if you got anything out of that. I hope you did. Share it if you can. Subscribe if you're new. Sharing it, probably the only way it'll get seen. And again, do the research for yourself. You don't have to listen to me. You don't have to listen to anything I have to say, but I have no reason to try to mislead you. I'm not getting anything out of it. If you wanted to help the channel out, every little bit helps, and I sure would appreciate it. And there are links for that down below. And what more can I say but stay frosty, folks, and thanks for watching.